So this is the fourth episode of the first season of the MediCrew Masterclasses. Today's session is divided into three parts. Section 1 is a brief idea of hemodynamics, which we shall need to understand the pathophysiology of edema and shock. In section 2, we study more about hemodynamics and understand how different kinds of edema are caused. And in the third section, again, we get back to certain issues of hemodynamics and understand how that brings out the changes in shock. And as usual, I'll be putting forward to you different multiple choice questions so that you can participate and interact. Please do participate. So this is the first section and this is your first question. If radius of an arteriole become double, its resistance will become A double, B 16 times, C 1/8 and D 1/16. Okay, we move on to the second question. The second question is, there are two statements and you have to tell me whether statement A is more accurate or B is more accurate. Statement A suggests fluid flows from high pressure to low pressure. Statement B suggests fluid flows from high total fluid energy to low total fluid energy. So I can see that the opinions are split about this. Let's move on to the third question. So the diagram in the inset shows you the diameter of the different vessels. And my question is, maximum resistance is contributed by the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, or the veins. Let's move on to the fourth question. The diagram in the inset shows you laminar flow of blood versus turbulent flow. And the formula below is the formula for Reynolds number. So the question is, laminar flow in a smooth, uniform vessel will turn turbulent at a Reynolds number of what? A 0, B 20 to 200, C 200 to 400, and D more than 2000. The fifth and the last question of this section. Murmur in severe anemia can be explained by A. Low viscosity of blood, B. High velocity of blood flow, C. Both, and D. None. Thank you for the responses. Let us start discussion on these topics. We'll get back to these questions again. Hemodynamics refers to the study of the biophysical principles of blood flow and circulation. Now, most of the principles in physics are applied to a perfect fluid. Blood is a mixture of cells and plasma, and hence it is not a perfect fluid. So what hemodynamics helps us understand is how approximately we can understand the properties of flow and distribution of blood in the vessel. The formulae of hemodynamics cannot be strictly applied to blood because blood is neither a perfect fluid nor a perfectly Newtonian fluid. But it can be approximated to a Newtonian fluid in most of the situations, and therefore most physical principles of fluid dynamics apply to hemodynamics. We have discussed in the previous episodes the analogy between Ohm's law of electrical current flow and the concept of cardiac output and peripheral resistance adding up to the blood pressure. Ohm's law predicts that the current I is equal to the potential difference, which is the electromotive force, divided by resistance. In a similar manner, if in a blood vessel there are 2 points P1 and P2, creating a pressure gradient of P, which is P2 minus P1, and there is a net flow of blood which is represented by F, and the resistance offered by the vessel is R, then here as well, in a very analogous manner, the F will be equal to P by R. Now, we also have the Poiseuille-Hagen formula, which predicts the nature of blood flow, or more precisely fluid flow through a cylinder. It says that, using the same diagram as before, if we can calculate the pressure gradient between 2 points and we know the resistance of the vessel, then flow can be calculated as the difference between the pressure multiplied by pi r to the power of 4 divided by 8 times eta L, where eta is the viscosity of the blood and L is the length of the tube or the blood vessel. But if we compare this equation with the previous equation that we studied, we know that resistance is pressure difference divided by flow. So using the value obtained from this formula in the previous formula, we get resistance equal to 8 eta L divided by pi r to the power 4. You can easily see that in this equation, 8 and pi, that is 8 by pi, is a constant. So resistance is directly proportional to the viscosity of the blood. Resistance is directly proportional to length of the blood vessel, and resistance is also inversely proportional to the fourth power of the radius. Now, under physiological circumstances, we know that length of the blood vessel usually does not vary unless there has been an amputation. Similarly, viscosity of the blood remains fairly constant throughout unless there is severe anemia or polycythemia. The parameter that can physiologically change from point to point is the vasomotor tone, and that determines the radius of the blood vessel. So the blood vessels can undergo constriction and dilatation under several situations. What is interesting here is you can note that the resistance will change by the fourth power of the radius, which means if the radius of the vessel becomes 2 times, then the resistance of the vessel, being inversely proportional, decreases by 2 to the power 4 times, that is 16th times. This is why the diameter of the blood vessel or the vasomotor tone is one of the most important determining factor of flow of blood. The vascular resistance can occur in series or in parallel. Diagram A here shows the typical structure of an arteriole. The length of the arteriole add up, and therefore these resistors are in series. Using a similar formula as in electrostatics, we can calculate the total resistance as sum of all the resistances. Therefore, the total resistance is always more than the individual resistances. In the capillary bed, the resistors are arranged in a parallel circuit. And this is calculated as 1 by the total resistance equal to the sum of reciprocal of the individual resistances. And it can be easily proven mathematically that the net resistance is less than the lowest resistance. This is the reason why, despite having the narrowest diameter, resistance in the capillary bed is actually very less. That is because they are arranged in parallel and not in series. So the smallest vessel which is arranged in series are the arterioles. And so arterioles have maximum contribution to the total peripheral resistance. Venules and veins have huge capacitance, and therefore the resistance in the circuit is much less. In general, blood vessels can be categorized by their diameter and position into arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. The structure and the nature of flow of blood across this determine the physical properties of these vessels. Arteries are elastic vessels. So they store elastic potential energy and that help the blood to move forward in a jerky fashion. This kind of flow of blood is known as Wind-Kessel effect. That is why arteries are also known as Wind-Kessel vessels. This property of elastic transmission of pressure wave maintains the pressure up to the vascular beds of the tissue. Arterioles are very narrow and sometimes associated with sphincters as well. Now, the arterioles being very narrow and arranged in series, they contribute maximally to the total peripheral resistance. That is why they are also known as the resistance vessels. Vessels that contribute maximally to the total peripheral resistance. Capillaries do not contribute any resistance nor have the capacity to store blood. They are the areas of exchange of gases, nutrition, and toxic products. So they are known as exchange vessels. The venules and veins together have great compliance. What does it mean is that they can stretch without rise in pressure. They can keep on dilating and accommodating blood. And we say that the capacitance of these vessels may be 30 times more than that of the arteries. That is why they are known as the capacitance vessels. Major fraction of the total blood within the blood vessel is stored in the veins and venules. Although they do not participate in contributing much to the peripheral resistance because they can store a large amount of blood. So the constriction of the vein will release a lot of blood to the heart, and dilation of the vein will store a lot of blood, not allowing them to go to the heart. That means the preload to the heart or the venous return directs on the venous dilation and the venous constriction. So in summary again, the arteries are Wind-Kessel vessels and they help in maintaining the pressure from the heart onwards. Arterioles offer peripheral resistance. Capillaries help in exchange of materials. Venules and veins are capacitance vessels. I hope this is clear to everyone. Now in this diagram we see, in diagram A, two fluids have been kept in a cylinder as they are moving. One of the fluid is colored with a dye. If these are perfect fluids, then we will see that after some time, the head end of the moving fluid takes on a parabolic shape. This can be understood mathematically, but also we can understand by simple physical analogy. The fluid that is in contact with the vessel wall, that outer circle of the fluid, is assumed to be motionless. It is at inertia with the vessel wall. The next layer of the fluid, if I divide this cylinder of blood into concentric rings, then the next cylinder of blood is in contact with that inertial layer and moves forward. Thereafter, the next layer has already gained the velocity of the previous layer and it further moves forward due to the pumping activity of the heart. So if this goes on in this way, the central cylinder of blood is the fastest and the outermost concentric cylinder of blood is the slowest. And this is known as laminar flow of blood, which maintains a parabolic flow profile. When blood flows in this laminar manner, it does not produce any kind of turbulence or eddy current. As a result, the blood flow is very silent. On the other hand, If the blood does not follow this laminar pattern and forms jerky flow or eddy currents, then it will start producing noise. Such noise can be picked up by a stethoscope or sometimes even audible in the naked ear. This kind of a flow is known as turbulent flow, where this parallel flow profile is not maintained. So what causes the laminar flow to turn turbulent? The tendency of turbulent flow can be predicted by Reynolds number. So if you look at the formula of Reynolds number, it is a product of Vd rho divided by eta, where V is the velocity of blood flow, D is the diameter of the vessel, rho is the density of blood, and eta is the viscosity of the blood. Now, what does this mean in clinical terms? It means if the velocity of the blood flow increases, then there will be more turbulent flow and the possibility of having a noisy flow will increase. If the diameter of the blood vessel increases, then the possibility of turbulent flow increases. If the blood becomes more dense, then the possibility of sound production increases. And if the viscosity becomes more, then the blood will stick more and more to the wall of the vessel, and therefore it will tend to become more laminar, arranged in concentric rings. Now, this can be applied to various clinical conditions for understanding. For example, I had set a question on anemia. Now, let us see how that is influencing the Reynolds number. In anemia, the RBC count is low, so hematocrit is low. Hematocrit is the most important determining factor for viscosity of blood. A low hematocrit translates into a low value of eta, that is lower viscosity. As eta decreases, Reynolds number increases. On the other hand, as in anemia, oxygen carrying capacity of the blood decreases, so there will be hypoxia. This hypoxia can cause stimulation of the chemoreceptors. And in the previous episode, we have seen that chemoreceptors have some influence on blood circulation. When chemoreceptors are stimulated, heart rate increases and blood pressure increases. So there will be increased heart rate. Increased heart rate means there will be a faster blood flow. So the velocity of the blood flow also increases. This increase in velocity as well as decrease in viscosity both will contribute to the rise of the Reynolds number. That is why in severe anemia, we can get certain kinds of sounds of blood flow in the heart known as the hemic murmurs. So the murmur that we see in severe anemia like thalassemia are contributed to lower viscosity as well as the hyperdynamic circulation or increased velocity of blood flow. I hope this is clear to everyone. Reynolds number typically can vary within a great range. Up to a value of around 200, it never produces sound. Once the Reynolds number crosses 200, the chance of producing sound gradually increases. But the critical number is around 2000. When the value 2000 is crossed, however smooth the vessel is, however uniform the vessel is, it will always produce sound. That turbulence produces sound has another application in clinical medicine and physiology. When we measure the blood pressure, we tie a cuff around the hand, raise the pressure, and then we try to hear the brachial artery with a stethoscope. Now, during the critical period of the blood pressure recording, we hear sounds known as the sounds of Korotkov. These sounds are produced because the external cuff compresses the blood vessel. Compression of blood vessel causes increase in velocity of blood flow, and this increase in velocity causes turbulence and sound. So there are many such examples where you can see when the Reynolds number crosses 2000, sound production starts, and such sounds in the heart are called murmur, and in the peripheral vessels are known as bruit. I think this concept is clear to everyone. Now let us come to the concept of total fluid energy. This is something very interesting. Um, we usually learn in our elementary school that fluid moves from high pressure to low pressure. While that is true in most of the instances, it is a specific case rather than a more generalized statement. Look at this bowl of water. Now I'll ask you one question. You see that in this bowl of water, the upper part of the water only experiences atmospheric pressure. The bottom part of the water experiences atmospheric pressure as well as the pressure due to this column of water. So obviously pressure in the lower part is higher than the surface of the water. Then why is water from lower part not going upwards? That means it is actually an understatement to say that fluid always moves from high pressure to low pressure. Here the lower part of the bowl has high pressure, upper part has low pressure, but still fluid is not flowing from the lower part to the upper part. Herein comes the concept of total fluid energy. Total fluid energy is a sum of the atmospheric pressure acting on the fluid plus the gravitational potential energy, or the energy due to the height of the water, that is the pressure of the water column, plus the gravitational potential energy. Let us now plot the values of this. Let us assume that the height of this chamber is h. So the potential energy at the top, because the height is 0, is 0. The atmospheric pressure, let us assume, is P. But I'd like to modify the statement a little bit. The potential energy in this case is actually not 0. The potential energy depends on the height. So the potential energy is actually equal to h rho g, where h is the height, rho refers to the density of the water, and g is the acceleration due to gravity. Atmospheric pressure is P, and for this particular height, the pressure of the water column is 0. Because the height is 0. At the bottom, pressure of the water is highest, and that is equal to h rho g. The potential energy is 0 because it is the ground level, or height is 0. And atmospheric pressure is assumed to be same within this small gap, and therefore atmospheric pressure is same, equal to P. So you see that the sum of the three energies are same in both cases. In the first case, water pressure is 0, but gravitational potential is h rho g. In the second case, water pressure is h rho g, but the gravitational potential is 0. Ultimately, the total energy, that is called the total fluid energy, at the surface of the water and at the bottom of the water are same. And because fluid flows from high total fluid energy to low total fluid energy, and there is no gradient between the two here, therefore there will be no mixing of the fluid. So a more accurate terminology will be that fluid flows from high total fluid energy to low total fluid energy, and not just from high pressure to low pressure. I think this is clear to everyone. Now, with this basic idea, let us try to solve the questions that we studied. So what will be the answer to question number 1? Wonderful. The answer will be D, 1/16. Next question. Which is the most accurate statement? Wonderful. The statement is B. Third question. Where do we see the maximum resistance? The answer is B, arterial. What is the critical value of the Reynolds number we are talking about? Wonderful. The answer is D, more than 2000. Finally, murmur in severe anemia can be explained by. The answer will be C, both, because hematocrit decrease causes low viscosity and hyperdynamic circulation due to hypoxia causes high velocity of blood flow. So the answer will be both A and B, therefore the right answer is C. The second section is on edema. Let us try to answer a few questions before we start. The force that opposes capillary filtration is. Next question. Etiology of exudative edema is. Next question. Hyperaldosteronism in liver disease is due to. Next question. Color of heart failure cells is due to. Next question. Hypertension, that is high blood pressure, in renal disease is explained by underfill mechanism. Is the statement true or false? Okay, let us discuss these few issues and then we'll get back to these questions. One very important aspect of fluid exchange across the capillary is the operation of Stirling's forces. Stirling's forces refer to the different forces that push fluid into the vessel or out of the vessel. The pressure of the flowing blood that pushes water outside is called the hydrostatic pressure. And the imbibing pressure or absorbing pressure of the plasma proteins is known as plasma colloidal osmotic pressure. How does the balance between these pressure maintain an equilibrium between fluid going out and fluid coming in? Let us assume that this is a blood vessel. We'll now see how the forces work across various ends of this blood vessel. Suppose this is the arterial end of the blood vessel. and this is the venous end of the capillary. Blood pressure is always high at the arterial end because it's closer to the heart. So let us assume that this end has a very high value of the hydrostatic pressure, which is the blood pressure. In an average capillary, the hydrostatic pressure at the arterial end can be something around 35 millimeter of mercury. This hydrostatic pressure falls to a value of, suppose, 15 millimeter of mercury on the venous end. On the other hand, due to the presence of the plasma proteins, the colloidal osmotic pressure is acting inwards. Because plasma proteins do not go out of capillaries, so the colloidal osmotic pressure remains almost constant. And at both arterial and venous end, the value will be same. Let's assume that is around 25 millimeter of mercury. So we can see that the net pressure gradient at the arterial end is 35 minus 25, that's around 10 millimeter of mercury. Similarly, we can see that the net gradient on the venous end is 25 minus 15, that is again 10 millimeter of mercury. What is interesting is that the direction of the two pressures are different, because on the arterial end, hydrostatic pressure is more, and on the venous end, the colloidal osmotic pressure is comparatively more. That means the amount of fluid that is going out from the arterial end, theoretically, the same fluid should be able to return to the venous end. This equilibrium is called the Stirling's equilibrium. However, it is too accurate to be correct, because due to change in posture, due to local tissue dynamics, presence of deep fascia, and many other mechanical factors, the exact output may not be equal to exact input. So a small deficit can always be present. If a small deficit remains, that will accumulate in the tissue and can cause edema. Physiologically, this is prevented by the presence of another set of blood vessels. So whatever extra fluid remains outside enters into this fine network of vessels known as the lymphatics or the lacteals. So the lymphatics now absorb this any residual amount of fluid that is there due to imbalance between the Stirling's forces and slowly returns that to the venous end. And this is how the entire Stirling's equilibrium is maintained under physiological conditions. So if there is any increase in hydrostatic pressure or any decrease in the colloidal osmotic pressure, the fluid will be outside. And excess fluid outside the blood vessel is known as edema. Hence, edema can be defined as an abnormal and excessive collection of fluid in tissue space or serous cavity like pleural sac or pericardial sac. Why will fluid accumulate outside the blood vessel? This can happen due to various mechanisms. So let us first classify edema to get an idea of how diverse it can be. Certain types of edema affect the whole body. So more than 2 or 3 areas can be affected by swellings or edema. Such generalized edema are called anasarca, and they are typically found in diseases where the protein is lost from the body, like nephrotic syndrome, or in liver disease where protein is not synthesized, or when the hydrostatic pressure increases in the veins, as in cardiac failure. We have seen in our episode on cardiac failure how cardiac failure causes edema. Edema can also be localized when it is present in only one part of the body. This can be due to lymphatic obstruction, venous obstruction, or inflammation. By the physical mechanism of how edema is caused, edema can be transudative and exudative. Transudative edema means that it is caused by either increased hydrostatic pressure or decreased colloidal osmotic pressure. That is by alteration of the Stirling's forces. Exudative edema means the pores in the blood vessel have become large. So there is increased vascular permeability. Any infection or inflammation will cause increased vascular permeability, and that causes exudative edema. Examples are pleuritis, pericarditis, peritonitis. These are all examples of exudative edema. By which organ is responsible for the edema? Is it heart failure? Is it renal failure? Is it hepatic failure? Is it lymphatic obstruction? Edema can also be classified as cardiac edema, renal edema, hepatic edema, or lymphatic edema. So, whatever be the mechanism behind the edema, there are some fundamental reasons for edema to happen. These fundamental reasons are either an increase in hydrostatic pressure, or reduced colloidal osmotic pressure, or lymphatic obstruction. Rarely, there can be increased sodium water absorption by kidney, which increases the hydrostatic pressure. And finally, there can be inflammation that causes increased permeability of the blood vessel. So fluid can easily go out. The last one is a cause of exudative edema. The first four are usually causes of transudative edema. So why will a kidney disease cause edema? Kidney diseases like nephritic or nephrotic syndrome uh, cause swelling of different parts of the body. Patients come with facial puffiness, gradually progressing to puffiness of the whole body. There are two mechanisms by which renal edema can happen. So we can understand the two mechanisms with the help of a simple flow chart. In some kinds of kidney disease, the basement membrane is damaged. The filtering membrane of the kidney is damaged. It is the basement membrane that prevents albumin to go out. But now as the basement membrane is damaged, albumin is excreted in urine. As albumin is lost in urine, the blood albumin level decreases. So there is a hypoalbuminemia. You know, albumin contributes to about 80% of the total colloidal osmotic pressure of blood, and therefore this causes reduced colloidal osmotic pressure. As there is reduced colloidal osmotic pressure, fluid goes out of the blood vessel and causes edema. Another mechanism by which kidney diseases can cause edema is, in some diseases, there is injury to the glomerulus or mesangium. Whenever the glomerulus or mesangium gets injured, there is a reflex increase in salt and water absorption. As sodium and water absorption increases, this causes increase in blood volume. The increase in blood volume causes increase in hydrostatic pressure. The increase in hydrostatic pressure causes two things. One is that fluid goes out of the blood vessel, causing edema. And the second is, it is the lateral pressure of the blood, which is called blood pressure. So there is hypertension or increased blood pressure. Now, if you compare these two mechanisms side by side, you can see one striking difference. The same mechanism may not happen in the same disease. So different diseases may have either the first mechanism or the second mechanism. But the interesting part is that you can understand that in the first case, as fluid is going outside the body due to reduced colloidal osmotic pressure, the blood vessels are gradually becoming empty. As the blood vessels are becoming empty, this is called the underfill mechanism. Whereas in the second mechanism, as you can also see, that there is increase in the blood volume. So the blood volume is increased, and so blood vessels are filled with blood. And this is known as, therefore, the overfill mechanism. So underfill mechanism explains edema due to loss of albumin. Overfill mechanism explains edema due to increased sodium water absorption. Blood pressure will only rise if there is increased sodium and water. So hypertension can be explained by the overfill mechanism and not by the underfill mechanism. So I hope this is clear to everyone. The same thing has been illustrated here, which you can see when you go over this video over YouTube. This is the same mechanism that has been explained with more words. Now, cardiac edema I have already discussed, so I'll quickly overview this. We know that in heart failure, there can be edema. Left ventricular failure causes pulmonary edema, and right ventricular failure causes systemic edema. The mechanisms are already explained in the previous episodes, so I'll go very briefly through the mechanism. If there is cardiac failure, we know cardiac failure will have both forward and backward effects. Because of the backward effects, blood will accumulate in the ventricle. So starting with the left ventricle, there may be left ventricular congestion. As blood keeps on getting accumulated, this causes left atrial congestion. As blood further accumulates, there will be pulmonary venous congestion. And this will cause increased pressure in the pulmonary capillaries. Which is called increased pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. So fluid goes out by transudation, and this causes pulmonary edema. Due to the high pressure, some blood vessels can rupture and blood can come out. That is why the edema fluid of pulmonary edema is pink in color. As time goes on, these RBCs will be eaten up by macrophages. In the macrophages, the RBCs turn into hemosiderin crystals, making brown cells. These cells are known as heart failure cells. On the other hand, if there is right ventricular failure, this will cause right ventricular congestion. The right ventricular congestion will, in a similar manner, lead to right atrial congestion. The right atrial congestion will lead to congestion of superior and inferior vena cava. And this will lead to features of systemic edema, like pedal edema, ascites, or engorged and pulsatile neck vein. So this is how cardiac edema occurs, both due to left ventricular failure and right ventricular failure. This is a histological picture of the alveoli. These pink linings are the alveolar walls. What you can see inside are the RBCs and edema fluid. As time passes, the RBCs are engulfed by macrophage and they become brown colored hemosiderin crystals. And this is the appearance of the brown colored hemosiderin crystals inside the macrophages. These modified macrophages are therefore called heart failure cells. An X-ray of the heart will show presence of prominent vessels in the hilum of the heart. This is again because of venous congestion. And as we have already seen in the previous episodes, this can also be called a bat wing appearance. Finally, coming to hepatic edema. Liver is a seat of metabolism. It synthesizes many things. It also excretes many things. As the liver cannot function properly, albumin synthesis decreases. This causes a reduced colloidal osmotic pressure. Steroid hormones like aldosterone are metabolized in the liver. So now aldosterone cannot be metabolized. So aldosterone level increases in the blood and it absorbs more sodium and water. Because there is already low albumin, even if water is absorbed, it cannot stay in the blood vessel. So it goes out into the abdomen, outside the blood vessels, and this causes ascites. So the circulating blood volume decreases because there is not sufficient protein to hold the water. So renal blood flow decreases, and this activates the renin-angiotensin system, which further increases the aldosterone. And finally, in liver disease, as the liver undergoes fibrosis due to compression, the lymph formation from the liver also increases. All these fluids accumulate in the abdomen and lead to ascites. So hepatic edema is partly due to reduced albumin, due to reduced metabolism of aldosterone, due to increased aldosterone production, due to renin-angiotensin system activation, and due to increased hepatic lymph formation. With this basic idea, let us try to solve the questions that we started with. So what is the right answer here? The force that opposes capillary filtration is. Very good. The answer is A, capillary colloidal osmotic pressure. Etiology or cause of exudative edema is. Very good. The answer is C, peritonitis. Itis means inflammation. Wherever there is inflammation, there is exudation. Next question. Hyperaldosteronism in liver disease is due to. Very good. The answer is C, both the mechanisms. Color of the heart failure cell is due to. Very good. The answer is B, hemosiderin. Finally, hypertension in renal disease is explained by the underfill mechanism. Is it true or false? Very good. It is false because it is explained by the overfill mechanism. We come to the concluding and the third part, that is shock. And before we start, there are 5 questions for you. The first one is that the most distinctive criterion of shock is. That is, what must be present to call it shock. Next question. All are examples of distributive shock except. So which one is not a distributive shock? Okay, next. Drug of choice in hypovolemic shock is. Next. Adrenaline is the drug of choice in which type of shock? And the final question. So if a patient comes with these combinations, low peripheral resistance, high temperature, high cardiac output, then this can represent the early stage of what kind of shock? Thank you for the responses. We'll start the discussion. So what is shock? Shock refers to a condition where there is a reduced effective circulatory volume and reduced tissue perfusion. The most important criteria to call a condition as shock is that the tissue are getting less blood. So blood supply to the tissue is called perfusion. If the tissue perfusion to vital organs decrease, that condition is called shock, whatever may be the etiology. We have to understand the concept of effective circulatory volume. This is a very important concept in understanding shock. So what is effective circulatory volume? Let us see. Effective circulatory volume is not a measurable quantity. It is a very abstract concept, but it's a very real concept without which the concept of shock cannot be understood. Let us take the example of three very important components of circulation. One of the component is the pump, that is represented by the heart. The second component are the channels or pathways, that is represented by the blood vessels. And the third important component is the volume, which is represented by the amount of blood that is present in the blood vessels. These three components cooperate with each other to maintain what is called supply of blood, that is tissue perfusion. So why are all the three components important in tissue perfusion? It is quite obvious that if heart does not pump blood to the blood vessel, then blood cannot go into the tissue. If the vessels do not have sufficient diameter, then the blood will not enter the tissue. And if there is not enough blood in the body, then what will be pumped by blood? Heart. So all the three components are important. But it is actually more intricately related than this very simple diagram, as I shall explain. Suppose the problem lies in the heart. The blood volume in the body is normal and the blood vessels are also normal to start with. Because the heart cannot pump, so there is less cardiac output and so tissue perfusion is less. So this kind of a shock, which is due to heart failure, will be known as cardiogenic shock. In the second category, suppose the blood volume has been reduced. There has been blood loss or severe diarrhea and vomiting. So there is low blood volume that is causing the shock. This will be known as hypovolemic shock. In the third category, suppose there is excessive vasodilation. Now, apparently it might seem that if the blood vessels become dilated, then more blood will go into the tissue. But you take this simple analogy. Suppose you have taken a wide diameter tube like the tubes that are used in the drainage system or in the manholes, and then you pour 2 buckets of water in that. The water is not sufficient to fill the tube and therefore it will not generate any end pressure. So the volume must be adequate with respect to the diameter of the vessel. Otherwise, less volume in a big vessel means less pressure. Similarly, more volume but a narrow vessel also means less blood supply to the tissue. So there must be an optimum relationship between the pump, the channels and the volume. And at a given point, when to maintain the effectiveness of the tissue perfusion, if the pump function changes, that can be slightly adjusted by changing the volume. If the volume changes, that can be partly compensated by the pump. If the blood vessel diameter changes, that can be compensated by the pump and the volume. So a mutual compensation operates. But when this compensation does not operate, tissue perfusion will suffer. So at a very compensated or physiological state, the interrelationship between the heart, vessels, and blood volume that maintain adequate tissue perfusion, that volume of blood is known as the effective circulatory volume. So effective circulatory volume is not just a volume, it's a volume expressed as a point function of the pumping ability as well as the capacitance and resistance of the vessels. This interplay between these three parameters brings forward the concept of adequate tissue perfusion, and the volume at a given point of pump function and vascular function that maintains this tissue perfusion is the effective circulatory volume at that point of time. So this essentially is the concept of effective circulatory volume. And I hope that this is clear to all of you. Shock can be broadly classified into 5 types. For simplicity, I'll classify it first into 3 types. So as we see that if the blood volume is less, it is called hypovolemic shock. If the pumping of the heart is less, that is cardiac output is less due to heart failure, then it is called cardiogenic shock. And whenever there is abnormal vasodilation, and this causes decrease in the forward pressure of the blood, that is called distributive shock. Distributive shock can be of 3 types. Septic shock, where the dilation is caused by bacterial toxins. It can be anaphylactic shock, where it is caused by allergy and release of histamine. And it can be neurogenic shock, which is caused by loss of sympathetic supply. So whatever be the cause, ultimately there is excessive vasodilation, and this excessive vasodilation causes reduction in the forward pressure, and so perfusion pressure decreases. So in every shock, the end product is reduced tissue perfusion. Hypovolemic shock is very easy to understand. In hypovolemic shock, what essentially happens is, due to any reason like bleeding or diarrhea or vomiting, there is reduced blood volume. As there is reduced blood volume, this will cause reduced venous return. As there is reduced venous return, there will be reduced cardiac output by Frank-Stirling's law. As there is reduced cardiac output, there will be reduced tissue perfusion. As there is reduced tissue perfusion, on one hand, this is the definition of shock, so there will be shock. On the other hand, due to less blood supply to the kidney, there will be activation of renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system will secrete angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction. The vasoconstriction causes further reduction in the tissue perfusion, setting up a vicious cycle. And this is what makes the extremities cold and pale. So these are the changes that we see in hypovolemic shock. If I compare this with cardiogenic shock, the mechanism is similar, very similar. The only difference is that in cardiogenic shock, the cause lies in the heart. So there is cardiac failure. Due to the cardiac failure, there is a direct reduction in cardiac output, and then the rest of the events are same. So both hypovolemic and cardiogenic shock will present with features of shock with cold and pale extremities. I hope this is clear to everyone. Cardiogenic shock can be due to deficient emptying function or deficient filling function. That is very similar to systolic and diastolic failure that we have discussed before. Anaphylactic shock, on the other hand, is caused by type 1 hypersensitivity or allergic reactions. Allergic reactions are mediated by immunoglobulin E. When they bind specific receptors on the mast cell, they cause release of histamine. The released histamine will act on the histamine receptors, which are called H1 receptors. By acting on the histamine receptors, they cause several effects. Most importantly, they cause reduced cardiac output, they cause laryngospasm, and they cause vasodilation. It is the excessive vasodilation that reduces blood pressure and ultimately causes shock. And the cause of death is usually laryngeal spasm. Luckily, the activities of histamine can be all altered by adrenaline, because adrenaline can increase cardiac output, relieve bronchospasm and laryngospasm, and also causes vasoconstriction. For this reason, adrenaline is the drug of choice in anaphylactic shock. It is also called a physiological antagonist of histamine. So the symptoms can be mucocutaneous like allergic rash, respiratory like laryngospasm, cardiovascular like reduced cardiac output, sometimes GI features like diarrhea. Management should be done with adrenaline. Along with that, for preventing the next episode, we can use antihistaminics, we can use glucocorticoids like hydrocortisone, and we can use H2 receptor blockers like ranitidine. Coming to septic shock. Septic shock is caused by vasodilation, which is caused by bacterial toxin. Bacterial toxins can be endotoxin or exotoxin. It is most commonly caused by endotoxin. So what is an endotoxin? If we see the cell wall of a gram-negative bacteria, we will see there are two membranes known as outer membrane and inner membrane. The outer layer of the outer membrane contains a unique molecule known as lipopolysaccharide or lipid A. This lipid A molecule, which contains rings of sugar as well as lipid, they are the bacterial endotoxin. How do lipid A cause endotoxic shock? So when there is a gram-negative bacterial infection, the body attacks the bacteria by immune system, and this causes release of the lipid A or lipopolysaccharide. This is the endotoxin. Lipopolysaccharide binds to a plasma protein known as the lipid binding protein. And the lipid binding protein binds to a receptor on the macrophage known as toll-like receptor 4. Once the macrophage is stimulated, the macrophage starts to secrete chemicals like interleukin 1 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, along with many other chemicals. Ultimately, these chemicals cause fever that causes warm extremity, vasodilation, and shock, and also causes activation of the immune system or immune response. So as there is vasodilation, there is fall in blood pressure and distributive shock. In endotoxic shock, the blood pressure reduces by so much that we have to give vasoconstrictor agents. Sometimes noradrenaline or dopamine can be given to counteract this. Along with that, antibiotics must be given in proper dose to prevent the infection. Exotoxins can rarely cause shock. There is a type of exotoxin secreted by Staphylo and Streptococcus, which is called superantigen. Such superantigens, in brief, they can cause activation of different T cells and B cells, cause massive immune response, and ultimately release interleukin 1 and TNF alpha, causing the same consequences. In neurogenic shock, we must remember that majority of the blood vessels in our body are supplied by sympathetic nerves. So if the sympathetic supply to the blood vessel is lost, there will be vasodilation and shock. The causes can be spinal injury, complications of spinal anesthesia, or head injury. And the fundamental mechanism is excess vasodilation. It has to be managed with fluids, vasoconstrictors like noradrenaline or phenylephrine. If there is bradycardia, we should give atropine or apply a temporary pacemaker. And if there is spinal cord injury, glucocorticoids are given for prompt recovery. So other than hypovolemic shock, there is a role of catecholamines in almost all of them. Hypovolemic shock does not require catecholamines. What it requires is intravenous fluid because that is the cause of the shock. If you compare the hemodynamics of the different shock, taking into account the pulmonary capillary pressure, cardiac index or cardiac output, the peripheral resistance or systemic vascular resistance, and nature of the extremity, in cardiogenic shock, obviously, pulmonary capillary pressure will be elevated in left ventricular failure that causes pulmonary edema. Cardiac output is always low. Peripheral resistance is high because of the renin-angiotensin system activation. And for vasoconstriction, the extremities are cold. In hypovolemic shock, again, pulmonary capillary pressure is low because there is no fluid in the body. Cardiac output is low, there is no fluid in the body. Peripheral resistance is high because of vasoconstriction, and for the same reason, extremities are cold. In septic shock, there is no reason for pulmonary pressure to rise, but the cardiac output is high because of fever. Because of vasodilation, peripheral resistance is low, and because of fever, the extremities are warm. Finally, in neurogenic shock, there is no reason for pulmonary pressure to rise. Cardiac output is low because sympathetic supply has gone out. Peripheral resistance is low because sympathetic supply is lost, so there is vasodilation. It is the vasodilation that can cause warm extremity by supplying more blood. So that was a very brief summary of the different kinds of shock. Let us now try to answer the questions that we started with. The most distinctive criterion of shock is, what is the absolute criteria of shock? Wonderful. The answer is reduced tissue perfusion. All are examples of distributive shock except. Very good. The answer is A, cardiogenic shock. Drug of choice in hypovolemic shock is. Very good. Intravenous fluid. Adrenaline is the drug of choice in which kind of shock? Wonderful. The answer is anaphylactic shock. It is the physiological antagonist of histamine. And finally, this combination is seen in the early stage of which shock? So to help you, let me solve this step by step. It says low peripheral resistance. That means vasodilation. So automatically C and D are ruled out because in cardiogenic and hypovolemic shock, there is vasoconstriction due to renin-angiotensin system. So we are left with A and B. Then there is high temperature. That can be seen in both of them. But then comes high cardiac output. In neurogenic shock, sympathetic supply is lost, so cardiac output is not high. Whereas in septic shock due to fever, there is stimulation of the heart and cardiac output is high. So the answer is A, septic shock. So I hope this is clear to everyone, and maybe now you can understand the relationship between the physiology of hemodynamics and the pathology of edema and different kinds of shock.